This is usually the bag that I will bring out in summer, July, August, when I wish I could be diving into a pool. Wishing that UK summer weather would be nice enough to want to dive into a pool. It's not always that warm. It's not always that warm. It's not always that warm. Hello, I'm Rumor, and today I am unearthing a rather old video response, Decks for Decades. I first saw this at the Three Fat Readers channel, I believe, and I just loved the idea of it. I loved hearing Danny and Lisa and Dustin going through how a particular tarot deck reflected a particular decade of their lives. So today, I have gone through my decks, grabbed a bunch together. I am apologizing in advance. Again, I've said it on previous videos. There is extensive home renovation going on at the house next door. There is hammering, sawing, a whole host of sounds that comes out of there, and so it's very loud for me. I don't know how much it does transfer to video, but I know that it can. And so again, if any of those sounds coming through, I really do apologize. But I better get going because I've got the Leaning Tower of Tarot here next to me. So I better start going through this before it tips over because I'm cheating. I mean, yes, it's a tall Tower of Tarot because I am old enough to have enough decks for decades stacking up, but I'm also cheating, and I have picked multiple decks for decades, and the thing is, it's really difficult to capture an entire decade of life, just because I find, like, when I really thought about it, like those first 5 years compared to the second 5 years, there's a lot of like growth and change that happens in that time, and so I feel like I experience different stages sometimes at the earlier end of a decade versus the later end. So I tried to pick some decks that would capture that sort of range of experience over time. And I guess what really compels me to do this now is because at the time of filming, my birthday is approaching. At the time of posting, it will have just passed. So I thought I would just take you all on a little stroll down memory lane with me as I look back on my life and some of the bigger moments that have shaped it and who I am today. So let's get started. In many ways, who I am today is not all that different to who I was from the beginning. For my first decade of life, the deck I have chosen, The Way of the Panda Tarot. This is because pandas are my favorite. They have been my favorite animal from the beginning, and they're adorable, and they're silly, and I'm not saying I'm adorable, but I'm definitely silly. I was as a child. I surely am now. But, oh, that's not a silly panda. That's a sad panda. Look at that, wearing a little party hat. It's just so cute. And so this is very much an inner child deck for me. It just captures that sweet essence of childhood and makes me think of the panda collection that I amassed. And I still have one of my pandas. I think she was probably the first stuffed animal panda that I received. I was actually 5, so I was already, halfway through my first decade of life when I got her. But Amanda the panda What a creative little lass I was to come up with that name. Sure, I thought of it all by myself. Um, but I still have her 40 plus years later. So this will always be a very central part of my essence. I showed this deck recently in my self-care kit VR to Lisa Pepez, where I was sharing a self-care toolkit that I had created in response to one that she had shared a while back. And it lives in that kit because it is just such a happy deck. And it, you know, obviously all tarot decks, they're going to deliver the tough messages, but the artwork just helps let me down gently, and it still cheers me up. It's comforting whenever I'm feeling a little vulnerable and like that little girl inside me is scared or sad. It's a nice deck that I'll turn to for that. But I have to, as an honorary mention for my first 10 years, I have to throw in, first of all, look at this rad bag for this one. 80s tarot. Oh, this makes me laugh. This is probably the most novelty deck that I have, but it's so worth it. I don't use it often, but I do use it. I get real readings from it. So it's just, you know, when I'm in just the mood where this is what I want to reach for, I'm not doing too heavy of a reading. I like it. I love all the references. It takes me back to my childhood. I mean, come on, like the leg warmers. I still wear leg warmers, you guys. I'm not above it. Mr. Bill. Oh no, oh no, oh! Just like the word processor. Come on. I was still using a word processor in the 90s. Who are we kidding? But I mean, my top 5 favorite movies, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Golden Girls are in there. It's not like the best artwork, but it's just, you know, the first Mac and the floppy disks, Rubik's Cube, a little shout out to Blockbuster Video. We had to go out and rent movies, the Etch-a-Sketch. Check on YouTube for someone's walkthrough of it because it really is worth looking at every single card in here, but I don't want to subject you to that. But look, it's the DeLorean. So like, as I'm flipping through every single card, it just makes me excited. And what I especially love is that the Queen of Cups is what I consider my significator card. And in this deck, freaking mixtape. Like, that screams me. I was all about the mixtapes. Again, well into the 90s. Filling it with songs, like love songs, and I would just be dreaming about the boy I had a crush on who didn't like me back. They never liked me back. I was just so dreamy, writing in my diary, and this takes me back to that time. So technically, my first decade of life only would have taken me into the first 6 years of the 80s. So there is that latter bit of the 80s decade that carries over into my second decade of life. But generally, this just really captures the essence of my childhood. Going into that second decade of life, this is another deck I've shown in a recent video, the Dame Darcy Mermaid Tarot. I've chosen this because, speaking of Dear Diary, little old me, that carried over into my adolescence, into my high school years. I very regularly had to express my feelings on paper, and whether it was in the kind of diaries that actually had the little lock on it, you could have a little key to it, or sometimes I just used a composition notebook, and I would just pour out my heart about all of that unrequited love that I felt again and again and again and again all through my school years. And this just reminds me of like, I couldn't draw as well as Dame Darcy, but I have drawings and I have drawings of mermaids. Like I was especially obsessed, in my like preteens, early teens with The Little Mermaid. I think that came out when I was in middle school, and I drew pictures of Ariel all the time. And I drew these pictures in my diary along with the poems that I wrote about boys and the song lyrics that I would sing when I was forlornly thinking about boys. I did love to draw. I drew all the time, and I don't do it now. It was never anything I considered myself like amazingly skilled at, but it was something I enjoyed. And so I feel bad that really fell off definitely by my college years. Just didn't really do it anymore, but that was a big part of my free time, and just sort of losing myself in that. And maybe that's a way that I kind of stayed in tune with my inner child as I was growing into a young woman. Yeah, I don't know. And so this just kind of reminds me of that too, beyond just the mermaids, just like, this very like hand-drawn quality to everything. It makes me think of my diaries. So then the other deck that I chose for my second decade, and arguably could reflect the full decade, but maybe more so the latter part of it, I've gone with Rider-Waite-Smith. This is the Centennial version. I was kind of hard pressed to pick a deck for that time period, but I feel like just in general, those school years were a time of conforming to tradition, which I'm tying in with RWS in the respect that this is what we look to as a traditional deck. And now there's all these other decks that have taken all these interpretations, but this is sort of like the old school go-to. It's just something that I do look at as like, okay, this is like your standard traditional tarot deck, and other meanings that I can pull from other decks with other artwork. I still always go back to these base meanings to incorporate those too. And I guess in that respect, it just makes me feel like, all right, I'm advancing into my higher education in my later teens and expanding my mind, broadening my horizons, learning all new different subjects, or going deeper into subjects that I had already studied. And so in light of that expansion is just reflected in tarot in general. But then again, just the fact that this is like what we consider to be a very traditional deck, I felt like I was still very much coloring with inside of the lines. I was a good student. I was very studious. I was very disciplined with my studies. I really put a lot of pressure on myself to get good grades, and I did not rock the boat in any way. I joined the clubs. I participated in a lot of different extracurricular activities, and I just kind of like did everything you feel like you're supposed to be that like model student. And in preparing for a career while I was in college, I started to break down a bit with that, because I felt in conflict of what my true calling was and what I really felt like destined to do. And I had a hard time finding clarity on what kind of career I would want. And so I defaulted to what felt safe and to what my older siblings had gone into, because I'm the youngest in my family by several years. And my two brothers are accountants, and my sister had gone into finance, and she's since made a more creative shift, similar as I've done. But I went into finance too. I just thought like, okay, yeah, I'm going to do business because I mean, it's the late '90s, and everything was all about like the big six accounting firms, and everyone wanted to work for Arthur Andersen, which look doesn't even exist anymore. But that was like, that's what I was like. I feel looking back now, I feel like I was very programmed to think that that's what I was supposed to aspire for, whether I felt a passion for it or not, or even that I naturally had any sort of knack for it. I just like convinced myself like this is the way to go. And I think I'm kind of maybe paraphrasing from the movie Dazed and Confused, talk about the '90s. I feel like there was a character at one point that says something about like, feeling like, her life was just one big preamble. And that I remember seeing that during the second decade of life of mine and thinking, oh my God, that's exactly it. That's exactly what it feels like. Like everything is just preparation for that next step. And for me, this deck was my preparation in first delving into the tarot. This is the first deck that I learned on, and it, has led to other things from there. I guess thinking of it that way, that is kind of what it just felt like at that time. Like it was just a preparation for the future. I was definitely starting to like think about like, well, what would really bring more meaning into my life, but not acting on it and not finding any clarity on it either. And so it was just sort of like, okay, tending to the basics then, like this is what you do. I've declared my major. I'm going to keep working towards that. I'm going to get my degree, and then I'm going to get a job in that field, and tick, 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 tick. So going into my third decade then, graduating from university and indeed getting a job in finance, Revival Art Tarot. I've chosen to reflect the first half of my 20s when I continued my path of conformity. I'm speaking to the very classic artwork that features in this deck. If you are classically trained, this is what you do before you kind of break the rules like a Picasso. But doing everything, very lifelike and executing all that technique that you learned. And so that's what I was doing in going into a career that was completely soulless to me. And I knew that the decade before that it would be. I tried to play the game though and just fall in line and go along, because to rock the boat would be, and am I saying that as there's literally, yeah, is this like the prow of a ship? I think so. Rock the boat. It's timing. But yeah, oh my God, it's another boat. Okay, I've got to get past this metaphor. I just continued doing what I felt I should be doing, and I still had my discipline from my student years. And so I worked hard. I put in very long hours, but I also wasn't like throwing myself into it though. I gave it my time and I did everything to the best of my ability, but like there wasn't that extra, that I was bringing to it. And so at the end of the day, as I'm taking the bus back to my apartment, I wasn't like unfolding the Wall Street Journal and seeing like, oh, what was the Treasury rate at today? I was like cracking open a novel and losing myself in stories, fictional stories. That's what I did as soon as I was on my own time. And, I started making note of that more and more as I progressed toward my mid-20s into the quarter century crisis, which I fell into for sure. 9/11 was a big factor in that too. I worked in Chicago in the Aon Center, which I think at the time maybe was still called the Amico Building, and it's one of the tallest buildings in Chicago. And I just remember driving in that day. I was actually running late that morning, and especially late once I was getting ready, and my mom had called me, and that got me to turn on the TV and see what was going on. And so I stuck around my apartment long enough to watch at least the first tower fall. And then as I was driving into work, there were still planes in the sky at that time. And so I just remember, I'm driving along the lakefront and looking at my tall, tall, tall building and thinking, oh, hell no, I am not dying in my cubicle. Not for that job, not for that job. It is not worth giving my life for. So I stayed on Lakeshore. I took it to the highway and I drove out to the suburbs straight to my parents' house and just continued watching news coverage with them. And I spent the night and, just trying to process everything. So that was a further catalyst for trying to figure out how to live a more meaningful life. Another layer on this, though, when I had graduated college in 98, I went backpacking through Europe, and that was my first time abroad. And this just makes me think of the experiences that we knuckleheads were having. I went with 3 of my friends, traveling across Europe and visiting the palaces and the art galleries and continuing my dear diarying through all of that too. I've got all my journals from those early trips. And just, learning more of the world and fancying myself more of a global citizen and finding some expansion in life that way. And it opened my appreciation of history and the arts and different cultures. And so this deck just came to mind because it just embodies that as well. I really thought in those first years of feeling that I was finally an adult, with my job and my ability to travel and feeling that sophistication or pretending that I had any semblance of sophistication. It was just like a hat that I was trying on for size. I'm this woman of the world now. I'm this yuppie living in Lincoln Park, Chicago. And everything I did, I thought I was really paving, a way for myself. But I just look back on it and it seems like I was just doing what everyone else my age at that time was doing, at least in my circle of friends. And going into the latter part of my 20s, when I have finally this epiphany that I need to change something. I quit my job. I went back to grad school to become a high school English teacher. And for me, that is still, a very traditional role to fulfill. And as an educator, I literally had to be the grown-up in the room. But that being said, I was able to color outside of the lines a bit more. I could be more myself in this role. I found I was not comfortable working in the cubicle. I was not comfortable with suiting up and sitting in managers' offices and just looking out the window at the lake while they were talking. And I just kind of heard them Charlie Brown's school teacher, wah, 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 as I was oh, I want to be outside. I want to be on the lake. But on the outside, I'm sitting very up straight and, giving the nod. And I remember learning the lesson of, well, if I don't have the answer, I don't dare say I don't know. I just need to give an answer, just say yes or no, and then figure it out after the fact. And if I figured out that I was wrong, then just backpedal and cover it like, oh, by the way, I was looking at this and it turns out, yeah, no, it wasn't this, it was this. That's what that job largely taught me. Like, it wasn't okay to say, I don't know. And when I became a teacher, you would think that that's the last thing you would want to do in that role too. But I just felt so much freer in the classroom to tell those kids, yeah, I'm not sure. Let's explore this together. Because, you know, I wanted to be more the guide on the side versus the sage on the stage. And I didn't want to be like opening their heads and dumping thoughts in there. And it just becomes this whole lesson in humility. It was definitely a job that kept me humble, especially when you're teaching teenagers. My God, you can never be too full of yourself in a classroom of teenagers. They're so funny. They're so funny. I had a blast with them. But wow. They can really put you through their faces and they call you out on everything. And so I think that that's why after a while, I just realized like, oh my God, it is just easier to like admit it, throw your hands at me. Like if they called me out on something, maybe I misspoke on something. You just had to admit defeat sometimes. That was fun though. It was very freeing to be able to do that and have that rapport with them. And because that's what it was like community building within the classroom and kind of having your own like special relationship with your class. So the joy in it was what I had, the creativity that I had in my lesson planning and those daily interactions with the students. And so finally getting around to the deck that I've chosen for this latter part of my 20s then when I became an English teacher is Danny Mystic's Mystic Masters Tarot. This is the first edition. I choose her Mystic Masters because you still have this old school traditional artwork, don't you? But then look, then you have spatters of paint and these different patterns that she'll overlay it with, and then how she stamps the titles on and not in a, you know, necessarily like aligned way. Like this is the coloring outside of the lines, but still having this like very traditional essence to it. It's like where the lines can become blurred a bit. And I love this. And I feel like this is very much captures those years of, you know, teaching. Because again, I was teaching the classics in literature, but then when you're opening it up to individual reader interpretation and teaching students how to make their own meaning and bring in what their own lives bring to a story and the frame of reference that they're viewing it through, and then it just opens up to all these different interpretations that show that just because something is printed in black and white on the page, it doesn't mean that there's like hard and fast meaning to it, that we can make our own meaning. And again, just my ability to be like more creative and silly, I just was definitely on the path of becoming more myself in this role. So yes, that was Mystic Masters, first edition. So now we get into my 30s. So just when I was feeling more in my own skin at the end of my 20s, got this new degree, new career path. I got engaged when I was 30, I think, and got married, and 3 months later relocated to London, in the United Kingdom, for my husband's work. It didn't need to be a career killer for me. I was intending to continue teaching, moving over to London, but it was just, I liked the job I had. I knew the community. I was a year away from tenure. I was going to be pursuing my national board certification. I had plans, man. That's my point. And I had people I loved right in the immediate vicinity. I had it all, and I didn't need to leave to appreciate that. I knew exactly what I had as I had it. A prevailing feeling at that time, especially since when we moved, there's a whole situation when you're going overseas where, like, you know, there's the stuff that you bring with you that you can bring with you and check on the plane or carry on. But then the stuff that needs to come over in the cargo, if the container wasn't full, we had to wait until they had more people's stuff to put in there and fill this thing to then send it on its merry way to jolly old. So we didn't have our stuff, I think, for almost 2 months. And oh my God, I mean, it's like, you can live without it. Learned that lesson firsthand. But at the time, it layered in with what I was going through emotionally, mentally. And so, not that I want to identify myself with the stuff, but like being in a new environment with like nothing familiar around me and no anchor for me there while my husband starts his job right away and I have no structure to my day. I have nowhere to go to. I have no built-in network like he had at his office. I was left to sit in the hotel rooms or in the flat without the stuff beyond what we were able to carry like on our backs. And it was blank. I mean, literally the white painted walls of this flat and very beige carpeting, it was this external representation of how I felt on the inside. I just felt blank. Because I did very much identify myself by who and what was around me before. And with all of that stripped away, who was I anymore? I really wasn't sure. And trying to just kind of capture what those first few years of my 30s felt like while I was battling this depression and kind of having my slate wiped clean, I've chosen the Tildwick Tarot, second edition. Now, the spaces depicted in these cards are far more opulently appointed than my little London flat was. But the emptiness of the spaces and the eerie quality that lends to this deck, I feel captures what I was feeling during that stage of my life. Just this emptiness, like it's an abandoned house, just musty, dusty, silent, empty, blank space. And there's a very somber, melancholy mood to this accordingly. It's a fascinating deck. I mean, it really is like these beautiful rooms that you can lose yourself into. It's totes haunted, this house, no doubt about it. So it's not like it's totally lacking life, but you don't feel like a liveliness to it. It doesn't have that energy. And why I also feel like this deck reflects that period of my life too. On a more positive note, hey, I got to live in London, like amazing places to go around and explore. And so this just reminds me a lot of, as I mentioned before, when I was first backpacking through Europe, you know, like the palaces and the museums and the gardens that you can explore. Just there's so much history here. That was the great part of, you know, this stage, that I had that opportunity. I had days opened up to just be a tourist and explore and learn. And this is what ended up inspiring then my next career trajectory. I found when I was walking around London, and specifically Brompton Cemetery, which I used to live right by, like a block away. And it was one of the first places I stumbled on my first full day after moving to London. And I would sit in there with the feelings stewing in my very dark emotions. But that was part of what brought me out because I would read the epitaphs on these stones and I would contemplate these lives, and it stirred me. It's a very old Victorian cemetery, one of the Magnificent Seven in London that were built in Victorian times to solve the issue with overcrowding in the churchyards. And it inspired me to like research more of that time period, research my neighborhood, try to find out what my, Victorian dated building, what year that went back to. And as I did roam about kind of like a ghost in my flat and in these other spaces, I would contemplate the lives that were there before. Because I mean, when you're living somewhere that's over a century old, I mean, our flat was at least a century and a half old. That's a lot of people that have lived in that space. And especially when you're thinking in a confined space and like the energy that gets trapped in those walls. And I mean, I would sit and dwell on this to the point where I was almost wondering if that was part of what was influencing me and kind of bringing me down, if I was feeling like the weight of these other lived experiences and maybe someone else's trauma. And London in general feels like that. Again, places are totes haunted and I feel the weight of that. I'm not psychic or anything, but that is a sensation that I've become aware of, let's say. And it happens many places over here, but it could be another story for another day. But speaking of stories, it created stories in my head. And so this is what encouraged me to write. And that cemetery that I was speaking of before, Old Brompton, or I'm sorry, just Brompton Cemetery, that features in the first novel that I wrote because it really got my imagination ignited, and I turned to writing as therapy while I was trying to process a lot. It wasn't like the next great American novel or anything, but it helped me work through a lot of stuff. It was very therapeutic for me to sort of transfer my feelings into a fictional character and resolve things on the page in a way maybe I didn't feel I had the power to in my real life, but then it also did empower me in my real life and made me aware of the choices I did have, and that the fact that moving was ultimately a choice on my part too. And it was a good lesson in like taking that kind of accountability and just making the most of it. And so, I mean, that's what I did. Then I just, fell in love with London, started writing. And along with that, I simultaneously became a fiction editor. And, these are the things I'm still doing now. For the latter part of my 30s, I would like to share Tarot of the Abyss. So whereas the Tildrick Tarot had that emptiness, this reflects, my life being repopulated. Not that I didn't have people in my life during the first part of my 30s, but it very much was a time of isolation. So that's where by the time COVID lockdown happened, I was like, I got this. This is my wheelhouse. But the connection, the really reconnecting and being able to authentically connect with people, I think, happened more as time went on, when I got less Eight of Swords, let's say, and I could get out of my head and this kind of cage of my own making and really get out and live again. And so I see this as sort of taking that blank canvas that I felt like and starting to get brush strokes back on the page. Things starting to take form again. My identity starting to come into more focus again, but not in the same way that it was before. I was obviously forever changed by this point. It was an evolution in identity, but and also just kind of those brush strokes though. It's not like completely clear who I am and where I'm going as I just had to like redefine everything and negotiate what this life was for me overseas, and everything became very touchy feely in my writing and freelance editing world. My days still continue to be very unstructured and isolated, since didn't I did for a time work in an office, and I did actually do some substitute teaching at schools. But I, for the most part, just worked within a very flexible schedule, mostly working from home, as I continue to do now. But again, it started to be a bit clearer what my direction was, and looking back, I was able to see like the stepping stones where things seemed so random to me, and like my career path was so rare. But I mean, really, like that biggest pivot was going from finance into teaching. That was the first step towards getting into the writing and editing realm. But like in this sketchiness, I mean, I've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed that flexibility. I've enjoyed that like kind of dismantling of my ego, where like I just had to get over it. You know, I was no longer going to have real status and money and have that be my defining thing. You know, my resume was never going to be the same again. And I just was kind of over that need to keep achieving on the next level. I never was like a ladder climber. I never have had a lot of ambition. And so my 30s really helped me by knocking me, if I was climbing any rungs, it really knocked me down to the first peg. So you know, just kind of learning like, you know what, that's never been a way I've identified myself. I don't consider who I am to be what I do as far as work goes. I want to be able to be who I am as I'm carrying out that work. But I just, you know, I don't want these things to define me anymore. And the material realm wasn't going to define me anymore, and other people's expectations. And so it was just sort of settling into this place where I could feel more contentment, like this, just in who I am, and feeling like I don't have anything to prove to anyone. I don't even have anything to prove to myself anymore, really, you know. So finding that kind of contentment, I just don't know if I would have gotten it, at least not this early on. I think if I'd stayed doing what I was doing, and where I was a bit in a treadmill, because for as much as I did enjoy teaching, I did feel underwater when I did it. I was very overwhelmed, especially because I suck so badly at behavior management. And I have to question, like, well, if I had stayed, would I really stayed in it that much longer? And then what? Like, if I left it, what would have been the next thing? I just feel like it wouldn't have been choosing as much from my heart as much as like what I felt like I was supposed to do. So getting into these sort of like wispy, loosey-goosey strokes now. Yeah, there's another decade, as if that's any surprise to anyone. I am at that grand stage of middle age. You know what? It ain't bad. I rather like it. Especially because of how this little monologue of mine is evolving. It's like the older I get, the more aware of who I am and comfortable with myself I become. You always hear that this happens, and it absolutely does. So coming out of my 30s, if Tarot of the Abyss was sort of showing that, you know, just my concept of self and what I want out of life and so on, kind of starting to come together on the page. I've made this comparison in a previous video. I do like to pair this deck sometimes with the Light Seers Tarot. I just think some of the finer lines of it, it still has that very like sketchy, wispy quality to it. But now the light and the color has really been brought back into my life. I feel kind of, there's some age diversity in this deck. I mean, a bit. But I still feel kind of like a fogey sometimes working with it. I do feel kind of old sometimes. There is just a very youthful energy and I mean straight up depictions in it, but it does kind of still capture, I mean, I'm not looking as young on the outside these days, but I still have a youthful spirit, and I feel like this too just reflects not like I am nearly as, you know, trendy and with it as the fashionistas in this deck. I'm wearing a t-shirt of a cat scratching a record. But like, I do feel like this essence, at least on the inside. This just has such a free spirit to it as a deck. I've just felt like I'm finally finding that, and I feel like I'm going through a second adolescence because I just had such a pull up my bum, pardon me, but seriously, I was just so by the book, so self-righteous in my youth. Very silly, as I said at the outset with the pandas. I always had that, of course. But now I just feel like I'm able to be more who I am and just more relaxed and casual. And like I said before, not feeling like I have to prove anything to anybody. And some of these cards also just capture that like mystical experience that I'm having now. And especially like something like this, like Mother Earth energy is something I very much am working with now. And so it reflects my practice and just also how I just generally feel as a human being. You know, I wasn't doing this when I was those girls' age. You know, I was like wearing penny loafers and doing my homework. Just so if I could talk to my younger self, I would just say, lighten up. Don't take everything so seriously. Sure, keep your grades up so you have options down the road, but don't put so much pressure on yourself. Don't make it everything. And don't try to define yourself in terms of a career. And so again, if Tarot of the Abyss got those brush strokes down on that blank canvas, now everything is all colored in and feeling full and free and light and bright. And, you know, I'm not feeling that way every day, of course. You know, there's prevailing feelings of this that happen because life happens, right? It's like you can't stay above it all the time. You know, as airy and fun and free as it feels, it does have like some darker depictions in it too that really get to the heart of how those life stages can feel. If it were out already, I probably would have picked the Buffy deck. That's another defining characteristic of my 40s I am finding. I first watched that series on the cusp of turning 40. And then during my 40th year, I was already rewatching it all and attending Comic-Cons so that I could meet James Marsters because I became royally obsessed with Spike. So if I had that deck in hand, I'd be showing that one too, but this one probably captures it better. And technically, I am already at the beginning of the second half of my 40s, already a year into it. In fact, I'm turning 46 this month. So I thought, well, since I'm dipping my toe into that stage already, I, of course, can't predict the future. I don't know what the next 4 years of this decade of life could hold for me. But where I feel it going, because it's already existing within me now, is what I feel in the Rosebud Tarot. Back. This is a collage deck. If I had to describe me and my life, At this stage, I would say eclectic. I feel like I am in my evolution, not continually becoming a different person. I'm adding layers along the way, as well as shedding some things on the journey too. But there's a lot that I continue to carry with me. So it's like, the Russian dolls. We just have like smaller, 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 smaller. And inside is that itty bitty one, at the core. And that's what these decks are like, starting with the Way of the Panda Tarot, like that's a little doll in me, and all these other things, conformity included. That's all still a part of who I am. I still have my moments where I am that person. I am still that studious and rule following person. I'm just also a bit more loosened up and expansive than I used to be. And I still love my old-fashioned things, but I also embrace the modern. And this deck, you see different landscapes, you see nature, you see man-made environments, you see the cosmos. It takes the mundane and it can also just lift it into this grander cosmic mystical space while still having that essence of the old and what's gone before. And so in this collage art, I just see those different stages of my life just all compiled. As human beings, we're multifaceted. We are really selling ourselves short and limiting our potential if we try to slot ourselves too much into categories. And that's something I've officially realized by this age. I am over it. I'm just me. And sometimes that's sloppy and it's a hodgepodge. There's not that one singular thing that's going to identify me. It's a multitude of things, and those things are going to change with time, but sometimes they might just go dormant and fall back, but then come back again. I don't think it all goes away completely. It's just that's what evolution is, and it's just taking everything and it's like it's making something new out of that. That's how we're able to have new stories in the world, whether they're written or portrayed through film or TV. They say there's nothing new under the sun because we do. We keep exploring a lot of the same themes. We have a lot of the same archetypal characters, but there are things that still continue to feel fresh and new because the way things are taken throughout, human history and people's different influences and come together, it does become something new. It's just like the synergy that takes place. So I don't think that like evolving and, trying to become, a better version of yourself means scrapping other aspects of who you were. So I kind of take it all into the fold. And if there are aspects of myself and things I've done in life in the past that I haven't liked very much, well, I just have to find acceptance of that and learn from it. There's always growth in those shortcomings if we're self-aware enough to find that. So this type of artwork, exemplifies how I am generally expanding beyond preconceived notions of things and just making meaning from what can seem like, scattered and random, finding the pattern in it, finding the meaning in it. And it's interesting, man. So, you have been very patient with me as I have gone through all of those decks. What a cheater I am to not have just picked one deck for one decade. And then I have the audacity to pick two decks for a decade that I'm, you know, only about halfway through. Who do I think I am? But this was just really fun, and it is really hard to decide on just one deck for one decade, and life is just not that easy, right? So it was really fun for me to just sort of look back and reflect on the road I've taken thus far. It makes me really excited for what's up ahead, and yeah, I felt very indulgent to make this so all about me for this time, but thank you for listening, and I would love to hear your experiences and what decks you feel reflect different stages of your life. Please let me know in the comments or add on to this video response. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time. Bye!